The desert in itself can be fascinating. This picture is taken of the Gobabeb research station in the Namib Desert. It is on the Gobabeb River, which is in the middle of the desert and divides the Namib Desert into on the side that is facing us, the stone desert, and behind the river we have the what is called the sand desert. And in the middle here is this research station. And the purpose of this research station is not only to investigate the desert and the impact of desert, but whether you believe it or not, these dunes, which seem so lifeless, house the highest concentration of insects in the world. Insects living in these dunes, the variety of species living in these dunes. And so for researchers, biologists, the desert is a fascinating place to be and a place where life is discovered. So desert in essence is not something where one says desert is bad. Desert can be a place of refuge. We know, for instance, in the Sinai Desert, which forms part of the later input, there is a monastery, the St. Catherine's Monastery, a place of refuge for more than 1,600 years now, where people went to find peace and to get close to God. And very interesting about St. Catherine's, unfortunately, I couldn't get a picture of that monastery. It is one of the few religious places where in the same monastery you have a mosque and a church. So the desert can be the place where people can get together and can come together, even if they are of different faiths. So the desert as a fascinating place of refuge. And then, of course, the desert can house immense treasures. We know, again, from the Namib Desert that as you come towards the coast, that there's an extremely rich diamond field, diamonds in the sand, literally in the sand. And so the desert can be a beautiful place. But the desert at the same time is only a beautiful place as long as you are in control, as long as you are able to live with the desert. The next picture that I'm going to show you, some of you might know this place, Koolmanskuppe. It was established because of the diamonds in the desert, because of the wealth that is found. A town was built in the desert to mine and to get the riches from the desert. But there wasn't sufficient water, and the designers of the town didn't budget on the power of the desert sand. And so they had to keep on freeing their homes from the sands dunes that were busy overrolling this little town until eventually they gave up and the town was deserted. Now, for those of you who have been there, depending on when you were there, you might find that sometimes a house is under a dune and the next time you get there, it is laid bare again because the dunes just walk over the town literally. So the desert can be quite challenging and quite a dangerous place if you are not prepared for what the desert brings. If you drive through the desert and everything goes well, then the desert is fascinating. But if your car breaks down and you are not prepared, then the desert becomes a place of death. Here, a picture of one of the many car wrecks in the desert. And I don't know whether the people survived, whether they were helped, or whether they had to eventually die in the desert because they didn't count on getting stranded in the desert. So the desert is a very challenging place. When God called Israel out of Egypt, they had to, in order to move from where they were into the promised land had to cross a desert. Now, just to give you an idea, just that we get an idea of what we are looking at, the distance from roughly where the Israelites were to the promised land is just under 300 kilometers as the crow flies. So it is 300 kilometers of a journey that is strenuous, but in controlled circumstances, and if you are handling it well, you can cover that distance in a month, even with a large crowd. So it is not a good thing to go through, but it is possible. It is a challenge that can be met with. We read that the Israelites were not really well prepared. I'm quoting now from Exodus 12, verse 40 on. The length of the time the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. This text refers to the transition when Moses requested Pharaoh to release the people from Egypt. And we all know the story of how Pharaoh refused to give permission. And then the 10 plagues happened, one after the other. And these verses are immediately after the 10th plague, where the firstborn in Egypt died. And Pharaoh was so upset about this that he then said to Moses, okay, pack your things and go. Now keep in mind, 30 days is the normal time frame that you would look at. The Israelites did not get a long warning. They weren't told months in advance, get ready. Rather, the Pharaoh said, now's the time. And the night that is being referred to is the Passover night, in which the Jews were all challenged to get together into their homes and celebrate Passover, the very first Passover, and to get ready, but it wasn't a long warning. So they could get ready, but yeah, it was still quite a haphazard moving out of Egypt. Now, the other important thing to keep in mind here is the reference to the 430 years. We don't know exactly how long they were in Egypt, but we know that they were there for generations. And for generations, they were slaves in Egypt. So the mentality of the people as they were called out of Egypt was that of a slave nation. They were used to be servants to the Egyptians. They were used to be oppressed. They were used to be without any rights. So it was a nation that did not have strong leadership qualities, that did not have a strong sense of independence. Rather, it was a nation that was used to being at the bottom of everything. We know that when God says, based on the biblical narrative, that I call you to go, to leave, that he then promises, I will lead you. And we then read, and I'm not going to quote all those places, but if you continue reading from Exodus 12 onwards, how the Lord provides a cloud by day, a fire pillar by night. In other words, the Lord saying, I will guide you. And again, we need to now realize that if one looks at this terrain, you can't travel for 30 days through this terrain. You can't carry enough water. You can't carry enough provisions. And especially if you have cattle with you, you can't just carry and take the shortest route. You have to move in such a way that you travel from oasis to oasis, from place where there is water to the next place where there is water, so that you can survive that trip. And God says to the Israelites, I will provide, I will lead you. And then comes the beautiful story that story you will find also in the book of Exodus, in Exodus 15 and 16, where they come to fountains and find that the water is bitter, the bitter water of Mara. And they start complaining and say, why are we here in the desert to die? Because they realize if they don't get usable water, they will die. And then Moses prays, and God then makes the water drinkable. So the water becomes drinkable. And so they move from oasis to oasis where they get water. But then the food supplies run out, and God provides manna in the desert. And the beautiful story about the manna in Exodus 16 is that as the manna is provided, the people, greedy as they are, try to hoard as much manna as possible. And then the manna that they keep, that they collect, the next morning it is all rotten, it is all full of worms, it is no longer usable. But to me, this is a beautiful illustration of the nature, not only of the slave nation, of the oppressed nation, but of humanity, is that I want to get as much as possible for myself. And so the time in the desert is also a time of teaching the people to rely on God's guidance, but also not to be greedy when God blesses them. And so the manna story basically then teaches the Israelites to accept that God provides for the day, and that they don't need to hoard, and that especially that they don't need to hoard and to protect from each other, but that they, in collecting what they and their household need, leave enough for the others to collect as well. So this is the lessons that the people are gradually learning in the desert. Then they come to the first detour. Now, if you look the direct route, I've taken a close-up picture. The direct route would be roughly like this. So they wander from oasis to oasis. And we read then in Numbers. We jump to Numbers 14. Sorry, I'm at the wrong place now. Actually, it is in Exodus 19, that after 3 months, they arrive in Sinai. So the 1 month has already now become 3 months. Now, if we ask what is happening now, actually, these 3 months, and especially the period around Mount Sinai, was a crucial part of the leading a slave nation into an independent nation. Their slave mentality, no own responsibilities, no own decision-making powers, needs to be changed into that of a nation that takes responsibility for itself. And so at Mount Sinai, God gives them the commandments, and we all know very well the 10 commandments. I don't need to repeat them. We can say them off by heart. But I want to summarize them because the 10 commandments have a very interesting compilation which form the basis of a healthy nation and a healthy society. It starts off with the relationship to God, saying to a nation that there is a higher being and that you are not the ultimate powers in the world. We know about the many centuries since people exist on earth, how time and again nations, when they became too powerful and saw themselves as godly, that was the beginning of their downfall. So the acknowledgement of God is an essential part for a healthy nation, the acknowledgement that there is someone who is higher to whom we are accountable. But the 10 Commandments not only deal with that, they also deal with the acknowledgement and the respect for the elders. It is captured in the commandment, honor your parents, which not only means your physical parents, but those who are older, those whom you should respect and look up to. And so this part at the Mount Sinai, the people are taught to learn to respect the elders in their nations. The slave nation, coming from fear of authority, fear of those in power, being taught to become a respectful nation. And part of this respectful nation then is also respect for yourself. And we can divide the remaining commandments and say it's the commandments want to teach the slaves, the former slaves, to develop a healthy lifestyle and a healthy work rhythm, from having to work day and night, sun up to sundown, into the 6 days and a day of rest, to look after yourself. So to look at your own health, and then respect for life. As a slave nation, and we know how the calling of Moses happened when a slave driver kills an Israelite, and then Moses reacts by killing the slave driver. So they were used to a violent environment. And God then says in the commandments, do not kill. Learn to respect life. Part of this moving from slavehood, from oppression to dignity, is to learn the respect and the value of life. Then also respect the sanctity of marriage, of relationships. That is then is the next commandment that is given to them. And then this respect for what is not mine. The last 2 commandments in the Bible, in the Lutheran context, the last commandment, do not covet, covet your neighbor's possessions, that we learn to respect and to live in a community where I accept my boundaries, what I have, but also accept and respect the boundaries and that which my neighbor has. And then there's this one commandment that I would like to sum up with the words integrity. It uses the words, do not give false testimony. I want to rephrase it and say, be people of integrity. So the detour to Mount Sinai was very important to move the slave people into a nation with dignity, a nation that could now live and take care of itself. And that was God's intention by leading them on this detour. It was an intention to help them with a mindset. And now disaster strikes. There at Mount Sinai, we read the story of the golden calf. The people somehow cannot cope with being dependent on a Lord. So they want to take matters in their own hand, and they create a golden calf. I want to rephrase and say they want to take possession of God. God must be in their hands. It's not enough if God guides them. They want to guide God. And this is the first derailment of the people after the Exodus, taking control, wanting to take control of God. And if we read the story, and today's time is too short to go into all the detail there, we realize that God then initially wants to just destroy the nation. He wants to give up. He says, I've done all this. I've guided them for 3 months now, but I'm giving up. I will abandon them. And then Moses says to God, if you do that, then the Egyptians will laugh and say, this God who let them out to let them die in the desert. So God, you're making yourself ridiculous if you do that. And so God reconsiders and then says, okay, and he restarts the process, and he continues giving the instructions and the guidelines, and then the journey continues. And the intention is that now they can enter the promised land. So God's intention, slave nation must become a self-sustaining nation, a nation with pride, a nation that can govern itself. And in order to move from slave to that, it's the Sinai experience where God says you need new guidelines, you need a new way of dealing with yourself in society. And then he leads them and 10 scouts are sent to investigate the promised land, and the next disaster then happens. The spies come back and they say, the land is beautiful, everything is wonderful, but the people are strong, the people will not let us come in. Only 2 of the spies come back and say, and God will guide us. And so we then read, and that is now in Numbers 14, where we read that the people protest against God and say, now we've traveled. By that time, they've been on the journey roughly for 4 or 5 months. We've traveled all this way, and now we are here at the promised land, and we cannot enter, and we will die at the hands of those in the promised land. We should have stayed in Egypt. So the mentality is still very much, this old system was the better one, and we don't see chance for this transition. And then we now come to Numbers 14, verses 26 to 30, which really is the introduction to the huge disaster of desert. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against him by spreading a bad report about it, the report that the land cannot be taken. These men, who were responsible for spreading the bad report about the land, were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. Of the men who went to explore the land, only Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, survived. And then the story continues, where God then says, and not only this, but I will not allow any of those who left who left Egypt, anyone older than 20 who left Egypt, I will not allow to enter the promised land. And that then is the beginning of the 40 years of wandering in the desert. So a 40-year wandering in the desert, where God says, I need to do this in order to literally take the slaves out of their thinking and to prepare them to become a nation on their own. And so where they initially thought they were looking at a month, 2 months, at the most 3 months before entering the promised land, eventually it turns out to be 40 years. I want to take a short break now and again push you into groups to give you a short opportunity, just 5 minutes, to discuss what I've said now. We don't need to get report back from the groups. The intention is just for you to hear from each other. What did you hear? Did you get the message? What did you hear? Do you have any questions in your small group? Welcome back. This was just a short group session, but I hope that it helped also if you had more questions. Now in the next part, I would like to now apply this desert experience of the Israelites to what we experienced in the past year. When in March, our president announced that there's going to be a 3-week lockdown. It came fairly sudden, but we had a few days' time, just a few days' time to get ready. The poor smokers didn't get any time. They weren't warned that smoking cigarettes will not be sold, so that just happened overnight. And those liking their wine, fortunately, they had a bit of a time to stock up. And so many people then stocked up for those 3 weeks and got ready for a 3-week lockdown. I know that many people looked forward actually to this lockdown, which to them wasn't a desert, but an unforeseen holiday, an unforeseen break. So for many people, it was a good initial 3 weeks. For myself, to speak very personally, it was a bit of a disaster. It happened and coincided with, I had a special study leave. I was busy finalizing a thesis, and I had this special study leave to finish the project, and then for 3 weeks I was busy with Zoom, getting to know Zoom, interacting with other church leaders, finding out how to deal with the lockdown and churches and all the implications. So it was, as we say, a deurmekaar time for me. And so when after 3 weeks, the president announced that it would be another 3 weeks, for some people it was not good news. For me it was, because by then I had settled in these technology issues and a few of the questions had been answered, and now I could finally then carry on with having a bit of time for working on my thesis. But if you now think the Israelites moving out of Egypt to Israel, thinking a month, perhaps 3 months. So they were in this mindset, and we were in that mindset in March. It's lockdown, it's sad, we are going to miss out on the Easter services, but by Pentecost we should be back. By Pentecost things will happen again. And I recall the many emails that went about, for instance, our song festival. Is it going to happen or is it not going to happen? And I just kept on saying, just give it a bit of time. Let's wait another week or two, see whether by that time we are okay again. Now, if I look back and I think how short-sighted I was, thinking that by May we would be back on track. And now we know that the 3 weeks not only became 6 weeks, but eventually we are in 9 months now, and it's still going on. So what seemed to be a short desert period, an interesting experience through lockdown, turned out to become quite a challenge. And for many, a challenge that actually ended up disastrous. I think of the many people that lost their jobs. I think of the many people that work on a reduced salary, perhaps even on a minute salary. I think of the many things that could not happen because of the lockdown. The funerals that had to happen without any relatives attending. So suddenly this lockdown, this desert that seemed to be okay, became a disaster for many. The question that I asked myself, and that is also part of our theme these 2 days, is to what extent can the desert period become a cleansing period? To what extent can this journey through the desert, through the lockdown, can be a journey into a new reality? And I dare to say, even a better reality. If you now take the comparison, the Israelites, a slave nation, with a slave mentality, oppressed people with a mentality of being oppressed and not being able to be people of dignity, having to be led through the desert in order to become a nation with dignity. And the question for us now, to what extent can the period of the lockdown be a period of transformation, a period of rethinking who we are and what we are? If we now look at all the bad things that came out in this lockdown period, one of the first that comes to mind is the corruption that is so part of our nation's thinking. How, as the first help packages were sent out, the corruption immediately swallowed up and grabbed hold of this opportunity. Corrupt politicians being used to putting manna into their own pockets, who then continued to collect the manna for themselves and not share it with others. How many help projects couldn't take off because the people were just thinking of themselves. So this bad part is a sad part of the lockdown experience. The other bad part, which I think of in our South African context, is how during the lockdowns stage 5, the increase in domestic violence happened. Now, if you think of Sinai and God giving the Ten Commandments as a solid foundation for a healthy nation, to then realize that in our lockdown period, it became clear how shaky the foundation of our nation is, how little respect there is for life, for the dignity of others, how little respect there is within the marriages of spouses towards each other. If we think of the theft that happened, and now I'm not speaking about stealing because people were hungry. I'm speaking about theft because I want what my neighbor has. I'm not happy with what I have. How our nation really, how in this lockdown period, it became clear that our nation really needs cleansing. And my prayer is that the lockdown time and the corona time will not only be a disaster, but will be a time of reconsidering. And that, I put it bluntly, that punishment will happen where it needs to happen. That corruption will be punished and not will be overlooked as we were used to in the past. So the desert journey can become a journey of cleansing. And if I think about the church, when we suddenly found ourselves without services, that was a huge challenge. The pastors suddenly had to learn to work with technology. I see some of you sitting in front of me who battled, who 9 months ago had no idea of how to compile a video service, and now you are experts, who had no idea of how to take music and transform it into a slideshow and a video clip on YouTube, and now you are experts. So the desert and the disaster of the lockdown helped us to develop new ways of doing church. I don't know whether you could listen to my sermon yesterday on New Year, where I spoke about Paul being in prison and then the Philippians caring for Paul and Paul experiencing fellowship even in prison. And to me, part of our lockdown experience that we are still in this journey is that we learn to find ways of fellowship that are new, that are different. Because as part of our Christian life and part of the church is the need for fellowship, of walking together, and that we find ways of walking together, so that this desert experience, especially now that it is drawn out, that we won't give up and say, let's go, I wish we could be back in Egypt. I wish we could be back where we were. But that we ask ourselves, how can this disaster help us to be cleansed, help us to rid ourselves from old habits that are preventing us from developing into the future. And if we can get this mindset, this change of thinking, then the disaster of the desert can really start becoming fruitful. And the rest of our sessions will deal with these issues. If I look at South Africa and on us as a nation, and I think this applies to many nations across the globe, that this time should be a time of reflecting and saying and thinking, where have we lost our moral foundations? The Ten Commandments. Where have we lost the basics of dignity, of caring, of integrity? And where do we need to come back to integrity? In the case of Israel, 40 years, one generation had to literally die for a new generation to get out. Now, I hope that we won't have this situation where we have to die, physically die, and a new generation to be born, but that what should die are those things of the mentality that are not conducive to moving us into the future, and that we should allow this to happen. and not only mourn and say, I wish we could be back in Egypt. I wish we were back in the slave nation that was better. But that this lockdown period will be a period where we say, it is tough, it is difficult, it is a disaster in many ways, but let's make the most out of this disaster. And as I say, this is going to happen still. In the next few sessions, we will be dealing with that. I would now like to take another short 5-minute break into the breakaway groups. And the discussion point that I would like to give to you is, where did you find the lockdown period disastrous? What was a huge challenge to you? The rest of the retreat, we will focus on what we have learned. But where do you say this was a disaster? And if I just say, to start off from my side, to me, being used to visiting congregations, to being in congregations, it was really a disastrous experience no longer to be able to go out, no longer to go, but just to work with the computer was really a tough challenge for me. So I'm going to send you back into groups so that you can discuss the question, where did you see the lockdown in your experience as a disaster?